So let's start our journey through the defined benefit pension schemes by getting an understanding of the basics of this particular type of pension fund. So all defined benefit pensions are clearly occupational schemes and they'll all be established under a trust, and we're going to look at the role that trustees play in the governance of these particular plans going forward. The trust essentially allows the pension funds to be held separate from the assets from the occupational firm, which is obviously going to be beneficial for any problems that may arise with the firm going forward. So these are obviously provided by employers for employees, and the benefits at retirement that the employees will be entitled to will be determined largely by the firm, and will also be defined by a proportion of the salary of the individual at the time that either they retire or perhaps averaged over a period of time that they were in the scheme. So historically these were known as final salary schemes, but because of the fact that some of them have morphed into career average schemes and different types of ways of defining the benefits on these, there's now a few other names that you generally would see from them. These were very popular in the 1980s, 1990s and around into the current century, but now quite a number of the schemes have actually stopped having new members applied to them, and in some cases have been wound up. There are examples of these in the private and the public sector. We'll look at both actually. We'll look at the majority of our discussion will be around the private sector, so non-governmental pension schemes, and we'll also look at the end of the various different public sector schemes that are in existence to this day. They tend, and this is an element of subjectivity here, but they do tend to provide better benefits than your average defined contribution scheme. Positive market conditions can sometimes mean that DC schemes are slightly better, but over the course of certainly the last 20 or 30 years, people that have been in a defined benefit scheme certainly haven't had too much to moan about. So looking at this in comparison with the other two particular schemes, we've already mentioned there that the majority of the defined benefit schemes will be established under some form of trust. And the idea behind the defined benefit is that it would offer a guaranteed pension directly from the scheme's own assets, from the scheme's normal retirement age until you pass away. So it provides a guaranteed pension for life, a secured pension income. One of the main benefits of defined benefits that you'll find also is that there is automatic escalation built into defined benefit schemes. So a pension in payment will increase each year in line with inflation. And what you'll get will very much depend upon a number of factors. The year's service that you've done, your remuneration, however that's calculated, final salary or career average, and also something called a scheme accrual rate. And we'll be looking at these accrual rates over the course of the next few slides, whereby this is all about the formula which helps determine what benefits you'll get, and we'll look at how all of these work out shortly. A defined benefit pension will automatically provide other benefits as well. You are going to get the availability of a spouse's pension. So if you do pass away with the pension having already started, then there will be a proportion of your salary automatically paid to a civil partner or spouse, or in some cases other dependents. And you also will probably gain access to a lump sum when you start to take your benefits, a pension commencement lump sum. In some cases provided in addition to your income, and in other cases provided by giving up some of your income, which is known as commutation. So there's a lot to cover, a lot to discuss within this particular section. So just to get an idea of the different types of a defined benefit plan that we may see. The historic one, of course, we've already mentioned, is your final salary scheme, where everything builds to a retirement point, so to speak, whereby you take your number of years service, divide that into your accrual rate, and multiply that by the salary that you had at retirement, typically your basic salary only, rather than a salary that includes any bonuses or overtime, albeit that's not necessarily always the case. You've also got hybrid schemes out there. We're going to look at these on the next slide actually, whereby you kind of benefit from the best of both worlds really. You can get defined benefit pension schemes that have a DC underpin, and you can get defined contribution schemes with a DB underpin. So we'll look at the difference between those two. They're broadly the same thing. They've got very subtle differences between them. But these are quite rare in the market and in fact in your exams, but it's something we will be happy to cover in the next slide. Then we've got career average schemes, which as the name may suggest, do not simply take your final salary, but perhaps average over the past few years or even over your entire working career. And as your salary tends to increase as you go through your working career, these generally will offer a lower level of final benefits when compared to perhaps a final salary scheme. Of course, it's not always the case. Some people decide to go part-time or shorten their hours, and in those situations a career average might work better. So you can't say with certainty that it will always be inferior to a final salary scheme. It's certainly not the case. So here we find the different types of underpin schemes. So we're going to have a look at these two. So we mentioned that there's defined benefit with a DC underpin, and then there's defined contribution with a DB underpin. And they share the same philosophy that essentially you get the best of both worlds in these situations. So let's look at a defined benefit with a defined contribution underpin. This basically means that the contributions that you make are earmarked into an investment fund, and if your earmarked defined contribution funds, the investment provides better benefits essentially than your defined benefit scheme, then you can benefit from the defined contribution scheme. So this can be beneficial for members leaving the scheme ahead of the scheme retirement age, as the DC benefits can continue to grow at that point. The other way round, defined contribution scheme with a DB underpin, well, essentially the other way round, but this is more aspirational technically. In other words, they will put money in on a set amount into an investment, which is a defined contribution, with an aspiration of achieving you a set level of benefits in retirement, which is essentially what a DB scheme would provide. So it can be a little bit more aspirational than the other way round with the DB with the DC underpin. Since A-Day, there's been far greater freedom for individuals to add to their defined benefit pension schemes. And I think we need a bit of a history lesson here to think about how this used to be years ago. So certainly before A-Day, having a pension that was an occupational scheme largely precluded you from having a personal scheme as well. You only could have one or the other in the vast majority of cases. So if you had a final salary pension scheme, a DB scheme, with your employer, and you wanted to make additional pension provision, then the way that you did that largely had to go through your occupational scheme. So you used to be able to buy a thing called added years, which essentially is where you buy more credit, you buy more years of occupation, rather than actually needing to actually work it to earn it. Quite an expensive way of topping up a DB scheme. And then virtually all, and eventually all, occupational defined benefit schemes had to offer a in-house additional voluntary contribution scheme known as an AV scheme, AVCs. And AVCs allowed you essentially within the boundaries of your occupational scheme to essentially put extra money in a defined contribution pot that ran alongside your defined benefit scheme. And then there was a change in the mid 1980s where they introduced freestanding AVCs, which allowed you for the very first time technically to have an occupational scheme, a defined benefit scheme, and you could also have with an insurance company a specific type of personal pension that ran along it that you could put your contributions in, and these were not without their own scandals. So we'll have a look at how that works in a little bit more now we understand the general overview on the next slide. So here we see the top-ups. We have in-house top-ups, so AVC schemes, which was a mandation that all occupational pension schemes had to provide, and added years. So that was very much linked to your employer, and you would arrange that through your employer. You would get all the details through the employer, and largely it meant that although your pensions, particularly with AVCs, would sit in more than one pot, it meant that really everything was visible to your employer at that time in terms of what pension provision you had. That changed with the introduction of freestanding AVCs, which essentially allowed you to redirect additional contributions, top-up contributions, into a insurance company ran personal pension that was specific for the purpose of adding benefits to your occupational scheme. You could take your AVCs and freestanding AVC funds separate from your normal standard scheme, and that offered a degree of opportunity to phase your retirement in and work it that way. Freestanding AVCs had a big scandal with the then FSA years ago, where lots of people were encouraged not to do in-house AVCs but instead to do freestanding AVCs with insurance companies, and that resulted in a big payout by the FSA to individuals that ended up buying one of the earliest scandals in our industry. But as long as we get the general understanding of this, we don't need to worry about that.